Hello, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you're reading this, and welcome to our fifth video recording as we carry on through our Lenten reflections on the discourses between Jesus, or from Jesus, more likely, to his disciples that started in the upper room and go on through as they walk up the Kidron Valley to Gethsemane. The last section ended with Jesus speaking of branches being grafted onto him, the true vine. And he went on to say this is the proper connection we need to make fruit. Without the connection, there would be no fruit. He goes on to speak of bearing fruit and that being the mark of discipleship. The next few verses bring the discourse back to love, keeping commandments, and he talks of the joy that this will bring. So we get these things all interconnected, don't we, of bearing fruit, loving one another, keeping commandments, and self-sacrifices being the signs of true friendship. And finally, in the last section which will bring us on to Saturday, if you're seeing this in bits, is another warning, a warning that's a bit dire in some ways, about the reaction of the world and the persecution that will follow all the believers. So let's start with today, and this is John 15, 1 to 4. I'm sorry, it's not. It's John 15, 5 to 8. I've lost my place, haven't I? And so we read, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like the branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish and it will be given for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you will bear much fruit and become my disciples. The emphasis has changed, hasn't it, in a way? Jesus starts to get deeper into the metaphor of the vine and the branches. And to grasp it, you need to see this notion that is there throughout the whole teachings of Jesus. He was on earth to do the will of his Father. He was there to complete his work. So we see in this an expansion from Israel as the original people of God to the new people of God, the whole world of believers. And there's an emphasis that we're all here and we are God the Father's to tend and be looked after by him. With the coming of Jesus the Messiah, the old image is renewed and replaced, and Jesus is the embodiment of God's presence and purpose in the world. Jesus once more speaks of abiding, and the emphasis comes from that old-fashioned meaning of abide, to remain with or in. It's got these connotations, very strong connotations of dwelling or resting. And this is another of the mystical side of the messages from John. Jesus is saying that the disciples should make their dwelling in him, and he will do likewise. There's an interconnectedness, a symbiotic relationship, if you like, and it gives us a clue to what fellowship is in the kingdom sense. The vine is given life from outside by God, but is carried into the whole plant through Jesus, who is the true vine. And this goes on as we think of the branches as the disciples and us who are today's disciples. If you think back, there's also a sermon from Paul in his letters to the Corinthians, where he likens the whole body of Christ to all the parts and organs of the human body. You know, one is not superior to the other. We all need to work together. And I think if you go back to Jesus' metaphor of the vine and the branches, I think the upshot is that the branches shouldn't argue with the tree because they need it. And we come to a really wonderful bit where if you think about what he means by glory, my Father is glorified by this, then the glory of the vine is its fruit. You can look back to Ezekiel, if you like, who says the wood of the vine is of little value. The glory is the grape. Isn't that a wonderful thought? The glory is the grape. I think there's many of us would agree with that. In the middle, there's this little bit of a warning as well, and that is, if you don't abide in Jesus, then you won't bear fruit. And what happens with trees that don't bear fruit? Well, the branches are pruned and they're thrown into the fire. They're burned. So how can we as a church capture the metaphor of indwelling and make this a practical theology to bear the fruits of the kingdom? What can we do in a practical sense as we think theologically of the relationship of God and Jesus with his church? And then we move on to the next little section. As my Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you, so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Sometimes there's not a lot to say, is there, about this? Jesus restates his new commandment to love one another. He reiterates his earlier statements about keeping the commandments and abiding, indwelling in him as he indwells and abides in the love of the Father. And then we get this wonderful, wonderful sentence, so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. So, bearing good fruit, keeping commandments. The end result, complete joy, complete and utter joy. What a reward for being true to Jesus. However, I think there does deserve a bit of an explanation. The word that Jesus uses for love is agape, which in the classical Greek world was the highest form of love. It was unconditional, it was selfless, it was undemanding, and it was even sacrificial. This is the love that reflects the very nature of our triune God. And isn't it so different from the concept love seems to have in our modern society? A concept of self-fulfillment and the pursuit of personal happiness. I love this, I love you, and then you go off and do something else. So often I've heard the words exchanged at the marriage service. All that I am, I give to you. All that I have is share with you. And doesn't this echo back to the way in which Jesus wanted his disciples to understand agape love and to follow in his footsteps? As a society that, in the main, seeks joy through enjoyment, is finding joy in this deeper sense something elusive? What in practice can we do to find a more fulfilling and satisfying sense of deep joy? How can we make sure that our joy is complete? Then we come on and we pick up at verse 12 in chapter 15. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I've called you friends, because I've made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask of him in my name. I'm giving you these commandments so that you may love one another. There's rather a lot in this, isn't there? And again, it's rather deep, and it's reiterating what's been said before. And I think this was the Jewish way of teaching. Rabbis would often repeat in slightly different ways a message. Everything there was at either end of the spectrum. There was no grey areas. in teaching in rabbinical Judaism. But if you look at the Psalms, there was always a repeat of what had been said in the next sentence, but in a slightly different way. It was an echo with all the changes that you get from echoes. But I want you to think as we reflect on this and cast our minds back to the last Remembrance Sunday service that we saw on television. If you reflect what is said about the sacrifices of war, there's always a phrase, isn't there? And it comes from the King James Bible, and it says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." It's a quote we often find in memorials up and down the country, in graveyards, on war memorials, and it speaks of the full commitment shown to a cause. In war, lives are all too often snatched away in a cruel and senseless manner, and to give the most valuable possession we have, our lives, is the greatest sacrifice. But as you go back to that quote, cast your minds to when you heard it, when you saw it. Do you ever hear the rest of what Jesus said after this quote? He said, lay down his life for his friends, for his friends. He then went on to say, you are my friends if you do as I command you. Once more there's this connection between following Jesus and doing things his way. In Jesus we see love in the ultimate context, that of sacrifice, totally self-giving towards his friends. Jesus has changed his stance, hasn't he? He's emphasized to them a change in relationship, from the boss who tells them what to do to a loving friend who gives them an idea of why as well as what. In the reading, Jesus says he has chosen his disciples. How does that relate to our experience of becoming a Christian? He also intimates that all his followers, then and now, have been appointed to bear fruit that will last. How can we know what that fruit should be in a modern society? People don't understand the metaphors. What is it that makes a difference? And our final reading for these next 4 days is also from John's Gospel, chapter 15. It starts at verse 18. If the world hates you, be aware that it hated me before it had hated you. If you belong to the world would love you as its own. Because you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, servants are not greater than their masters. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. If they kept my word, they would also keep yours. But they will do all of these things to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me. This little section brings about a far-reaching change, and one that runs through the rest of the discourse. It's on a very somber note that Jesus gives this stark warning of hatred towards his disciples. He reminds them that the world hates him before it hates the disciples. The message is quite simple. If you follow the worldly ways, then you will be loved by the world at large. However, if you follow the ways of the kingdom, you'll be persecuted, and that's all there is. Jesus marks a division and conflict between worldly values and the radical values that he espoused for the kingdom. Jesus doesn't seem to think this is a personal or surface level dislike, I don't think. He saw this as a deeply spiritual matter. His words speak of the world not only failing to understand his mission, but failing to know God. He uses the words, they did not know him who sent me. This harks back to the divide that had opened up in Israel between the temple authorities and the God they purported to serve. The political and temple leaders had failed to see and understand the marks of God's authority in the works of Jesus. Consequently, they failed miserably to connect the divine with the human side of Jesus. I think it's worthwhile saying at this time, John's Gospel is thought to have been written towards the end of the first century, and given the persecution of the early Christian church, these sayings of Jesus would have assumed great relevance to John's readers. If not hated, at the very least Christians were marked out and treated with contempt and suspicion by the authorities in both imperial and religious circles. They may have been just sort of seen as another weird bunch by everyone else, but there was this breaking down of any relevance to what Jesus said and to where they were going. So is it sometimes hard to see beyond the outward appearance of a group or individual, and why government, schools, parents, or the church are sources of grievance? Does such behaviour spring from the heart of our personality, where our values are formed and nourished? How could our society begin to accept that many of its problems are not just cultural, political, or economic, but are at the very root of our spirituality? I hope that these readings are giving you time to reflect and time to think throughout Lent. And remember that God will always be with you as you remember what Jesus is trying to tell us. So do as Jesus asked us, follow his commandments, love one another, and you will bear fruit. Amen.